Street was really a market for finding work for musicians. We used to congregate there Monday morning, and it had a little life of its own, Archer Street. All the jazzers and the dance band players and ones that did West End theatres and functions were on one side of the road, and the orchestral players were on the other side. We knew where we were to stand. I had my place where I stood, and you were approached by band leaders, or you went to see somebody, said, is there any work going, or does somebody need a vibes player? And you met other players and some of the guys that put bands together. And there was a little way of doing things. They would go like this, which meant it was £3, and they would see it's C&T, which meant it was chips and a taxi home. You could always meet Ronnie Scott and Tubby in the Harmony Inn, which was a lovely cafe there. The plan was that you went there, chatted, got your work, and there was a bar, I think it was Alan's bar called, which opened, of course, when the pubs closed at 2 o'clock. But I did meet the other guys that were putting bands together. Dave Shepherd, who had a Benny Goodman band, Vic Hash, who had more of a bebop clarinet band, and I met a guy called Alan Mack, who was a very good jazz violin player, a bebop amplified violin, and he also sang. And he asked me if I would go to Edinburgh for the short season at the West End Cafe, which was really tea dance and music in the afternoon for nice Scottish ladies having tea and pancakes. And we were always getting problems because Alan would not turn the amplifier down. While we were in Edinburgh, of course, we met the Scottish musicians that were up there, and there was a very good band at the Fountain Bridge Palais led by Jimmy Walker, who was later to become who we used to call the Chief Dot. He was the leader of the Polka Dots vocal group. He had a lovely bass player called Ashley Kozak, and we had a party and there were a few drinks exchanged, and we couldn't find Ashley, and he was lying in the bath, fully clothed, shouting, "I'm a disgrace, I'm a disgrace." Anyway, while I was at the West End Ballroom, I had a call, or a telegram, from Ralph Sharon, and he said, "Victor Feldman gone to the States, can you join my sextet? Are you interested?" I got back to Ralph, and he said, "Okay, if you want to join the Ralph Sharon sextet, we're at Hull for a Sunday concert next Sunday, be there." I was already set up in the theatre and waiting for Ralph to arrive, and I thought there'd be a band call or a rehearsal in the evening before the show. And Ralph said, "Oh no, you know all my tunes." And I said, "Well, could I have the music?" He said, "Oh, there's no music, you've got to busk along with us." And I did the gig and went back to London on Ralph's band coach. And that was my association starting with Ralph. I was still a freelance player, so I went back to basement room in Mornington Crescent and took up where I left off, trying to get freelance work in the clubs with varying jazz groups. Vic Richards, who was a very good drummer, he had a little trio in a drinking club in Soho. And with Ralph, we started doing the proper work, in other words, Ronnie Scott's, the Club 11, and a few little tours. We went to Wales for a one-nighter, and the support to Ralph Sharon Sextet was Big Bill Brunsey, who was a well-known, lovely jazz blues guitar player, singer. So we went to this, it was just like a village hall in South Wales, for a Sunday concert. I think we had two old ladies with black hats on and two sheep, but the music was very good. But it took about 8 hours to get there and home at night in the evening. So touring for jazz wasn't easy. At that Sunday concert in Wales, I learnt a very important thing. And Ralph said we're going to do our same programme as we would do as if we were playing in Carnegie Hall. And Ralph played exactly the same, his wonderful piano playing, a great performance on Body and Soul. And I learnt then that no matter what the gig is, whether it's in a jazz club or in a concert hall or a village hall, you always gave 100% and you got the music right and you did the same job. One of the gigs we had was in Sheffield to illustrate Ralph's sense of humour. We had a bass player who was quite well known in the West End, and he'd been a bass player with Ray Ellington. And his claim to fame was, I think he was one of the only musicians in England to have recorded with Fats Waller. But Lenny had no idea what anything happened outside London. We were going into Sheffield, and Lenny looked out of the window and he saw these two cooling towers. And he said, I wonder what they make there. And Ralph said, binoculars. And one of the things that Ralph did, to our amazement, he took a summer season at Weymouth. We had to play for old-time dancing on one night, square dancing on one night, and light music in the afternoon for people sitting in the deck chairs. We were a cool, West End, sophisticated jazz group. Old-time dance music, he had no idea, and the audience sometimes used to shake their fists and shout at us. One gentleman came up and said, don't you know there are 104 bars in a waltz cotillion? And Ralph said, no, but I know the chords of these foolish things. And that was how Ralph treated the gig. I did the calling for the square dance and got an extra 10 bob a week. In Ralph's wisdom, he thought, if we've got to play light music in the afternoon, I'll get some strings to go with the sextet, which will make it a bit orchestral. So he hired two violin players from Bristol, from the BBC orchestra there, because they had a library of waltzes and overtures and selections from the shows. But we didn't have rehearsal, we just used to get through it as best we can in the afternoon. We struggled through about 8 bars of absolute chaos, so Ralph had to stop and apologise to the audience that he was sorry that something was wrong with the music. What we hadn't done was check the parts, and there were 2 pages missing. But we played on for about 8 bars before anybody realised. Ralph was always having to go to the head of entertainments at Weymouth Council, and obviously there for a telling off. So we were very pleased really when the season at Weymouth finished and we went back to our natural environment, which is the Soho and the West End and the London scene. We had a visitation in Weymouth of a student exchange, and there were some really nice girls came from France, from Paris, and spent a few weeks in Weymouth. And I formed an association with a very nice girl. We used to go on the beach with a gang of us and try and offset the disasters of the tour, of the show. And we agreed to meet up when we left the season in London. And then I found out that she'd been seeing my mate, the saxophone player, and he said, well, we didn't tell you because it's got serious and we're going to get married. Congratulations. I said, oh, that's great. I'm very happy for you. Anyway, he went to Paris with her. She knifed him. So it was perhaps, I was well off out of that. Ronnie Scott opened his first club in Gerrard Street, which was downstairs. Very difficult to get your vibraphone in and out. You had to have a food licence if you wanted to sell drinks after 10:30 when the band closed. So Ronnie put cheese sandwiches on the table so we could drink and open and play music after the pub times had closed. And the jazz clubs were really drinking clubs, and the gangsters, of course, got involved with that. Yeah. And the other side of the jazz scene in Soho, apart from the cool Johnny Dankworth, Seven, Ralph's Sextet, Vic Ash's Quartet, there was the trad side with George Melly, and we were alternating with them at Ronnie's or the Club 11. You've got to see the same people quite a lot, the jazz fans, and a lot of society people like to be seen at Ronnie Scott's. It was in the days when musicians went there after their West End shows to see a particular American jazz artist, and it brought in the same sort of crowd all the time. And you'd get people like, as we know now, Spike Milligan would go in, a few politicians would go, and they would go from club to club, really. And the 100 Oxford Street, which was the big one, Humphrey Littleton, and people knew the jazz clubs as being places where you could drink, socialise with people that loved jazz music. There's a lovely story of the alto sax player, Bruce Turner. When he went into Humphrey Littleton's band, and he'd been a bebop player, people were shouting from the audience, "Go home, dirty bebopper." Did a few gigs with other bands, one of which was Dave Shepherd. And he had a drummer called Kenny Harris, who was a lovely beboppy drummer. He said, would I do a couple of gigs with an organ player that he was working with called Jerry Allen. So I agreed to do this. I went down to Bath with Jerry Allen. So I was with Ralph, and I got a letter actually, this was 1952, to say he was reforming his Jerry Allen trio to do variety. Was I interested? And I thought about this, and I thought I'd been an entertainer. I fancied doing variety and a bit of stage work. The first week of variety was at the Palace Hull. So I asked Jerry where we were going to rehearse the act, and he said, well, at my house, my family house, which is at Margate. Jerry had an old ambulance. We went to Hull and did our first week with the Ralph Reader Gang Show.
There were some French girls there. I should yes, tell it, because it was before anybody else was around. I don't know, that's good. And we do a bit about the groupies, that's the thing. Daddy, he wants to know about the groupies.